Oslo, and she also has a 13-year background as a documentary filmmaker at NRK. This is the Norwegian public broadcaster, if you are not from Norway. In her practice-led PhD, Elisabeth has researched mediation and cinematic place thinking through experimental film practice. Andreas is an artist and a researcher. He has a PhD in media studies from the University of Oslo as well. His artistic practice explores ecosystem interactions across different scales, from microorganisms to brands. In his PhD, Andreas researched the aspect of digital living that divert our attention, like, for example, play, stupidity, cuteness, and humor. So they will be talking today, introducing us to two different concepts of creativity. I'm going to leave to them the floor. They're going to make a short introduction about the concept. Then Andreas is going to present first, followed by Elisabeth. So if you can hold your questions, so we will leave them for the second part of this session. So after the presentations, we will have a 10 minutes break. And yes, and we hope to you will join in conversation with them. So I'll leave the floor to both Andreas and Elisabeth.
So hello, and very nice to see you. I will share my screen before I start to talk further.
Let's take a brief second to thank the organizers for doing this and for inviting us and for letting us present. This is great. Thank you for that.
Yes, thanks a lot for that. So the format that Andreas and I have chosen today is a bit dialogical. So when Andreas is interfering with my speech, that's I'm not getting offended at all, because that's part of the plan. So he can, while I'm presenting, he can just suddenly appear. So we have our starting idea was to have a framework to discuss our, within we can discuss our PhD processes. And it's kind of pragmatic. It's not very too serious, really, but it's interesting, we think, to have this conceptual or experimental, you might say, kind of a line or a scale, because our PhD processes are very different, but at the same time, we have that in common, that our creative practice is very much bound up with the methods of research or the way we have been researching. And we thought it would be very fun to discuss the possibility of creativity in research according to this parameter. So they are useful as a starting point. And let's see. And the starting point is this spectrum, conceptual and experimental, which is based on a study by the economist David Gallinson, not so famous for people in the humanities, perhaps, but he was studying creativity in a range of arts and was interested in technological innovation and was curious of how creativity works and if there were different kinds of creativity. So he was studying painting, poetry, and other art forms, starting with poetry. So he wanted to find out whether youthful energy and creative genius were necessarily connected, because he assumed or thought they were like a prejudice that the real geniuses peaked early. So that was his starting point. And he ended up with this conceptual pair, or this spectrum. And as his major example of the conceptual creative, he had, for instance, Pablo Picasso, who he meant that he was indeed a conceptual creative because he was more interested in finding the concept and working within that than searching or researching in the process, learning, finding the way. And he had a clear idea of what he wanted to do, and then he just did it. And as you can see here, you have Weeping Woman from 1937, in which you have his working within his analytic cubism, which he painted within, worked within that over some time. And another asset of the conceptual creative is that the evolution of work is less important. And he was peaking, or he was breaking through.
Maybe in evolution, in the sense of like the artwork rather than the process, like the object,
Yeah.
the result more than the process, maybe.
Yes. And then you have the opposite, or the experimental creative, which was exemplified with Paul Cézanne, a rather dark and gloomy figure it could seem like. But this is actually the art critic Gustave, I'm not sure how I pronounce the last name, but Geoffroy, perhaps. He had to endure 80 sittings for Cézanne, and he was painting again and again the same motives, and was searching through trial and error, experimenting, having a grand vision of what he tried to do, and tried again and again, was never happy, and ended up destroying a lot of canvases, and it took time. And according to Galenson, his most valued work appeared at the end of his life. So let's see. And this is his painting of Mont Sainte-Victoire, which was also painted again and again from slightly different perspectives, trying to capture kind of the mountain as it became perception, so to speak. So how do these parameters add or apply to research? Me and Andreas have been asking ourselves that, and how do we fit into the picture? As mentioned, our projects have been kind of different, and we would perhaps place ourselves somewhat near each of our sides. Andreas perhaps towards the conceptual, and me towards the experimental, perhaps. And well, that's what we're going to explore.
And maybe I want to add to that, like this poll, as Elisabeth started by saying, it's a sort of a pragmatic approach from us. We're not sort of tied to these as terms, and we're not necessarily like finished thinking about these things. The conceptual experimental is perhaps not the only terms one might use. They're not the perfect terms, and they're not necessarily in opposition, as in like, I'm conceptual, Elisabeth is experimental. They could also be thought of as like different modes, different parts of doing research, different aspects of processes. But at the same time, there is a value in doing what we're doing now, where we set up this poll, because it makes it easier to sort of make clear the differences between these as modes or as preferences of different people.
Great. And I think you have something to present. You will present, Andreas will present his project rather briefly.
So we're both gonna present. I'm gonna present first, and I thought I'd start not with my project. I'd start with my artistic practice. And part of the reason I wanted to start there is not the least because it's more visual than showing my PhD thesis, but also because a lot of the approaches that I've used working as an artist map onto or something that I continue with in my research and in my writing on different forms of media, different forms of media analysis. And I think in a sense, this can be sort of framed as a form of creative limitations. And it's creative limitations in a sense of setting up a form of a system or a structure or a concept, and then using that as the starting point of creativity. So not using limitations as somehow sort of to make something make sense or to delimit certain aspects, but rather to set up boundaries and then work from within those boundaries to explore something. And so this is an image from what has been my main artistic output since 2014, my main artistic project since 2014. And it is a project called Sanke, and this is it's a Norwegian word for gather, as in hunter-gatherer and gathering. And it's a project that takes as its starting point an interest that I had in things like climate change, primitivism, nature, those sort of things, health and wellness. And I had this idea, like I enjoy paradoxes, I enjoy contrasts, I enjoy putting together things that don't seem to match, don't seem to add up. So I had this idea of putting together my interest in health and wellness, nature, primitivism, those sort of things, with something that you could think of as its sort of polar opposite. So things like a company, things like a high-end luxury company. So I had this idea of framing then the art project as a company, framing it as a sort of avant luxury primitivist company. And so what this did was that it set a sort of boundary, set a system where I worked within making art objects as forms of products. So here I have then a couple of examples of products. On the left here, a toothbrush, a sort of troll toothbrush I made from a stick and some horse hair. And then on the right here, some birch bark shoes that I made. And I also have things like a perfume with the smell of wet earth. And so the process here was then using products as a format of exploring and creating things, creating sculptures, creating things that would make sense as a sort of fictive, I guess, luxury brand. And I also set the parameter for me to sort of make these products somehow playful, somehow experimental, but not in the sense of like being a parody. They should have some uncertainty to them, to what kind of position they have as an object. And going back here to this this hair, this is then an exhibition setting where I framed the project as Sanke being a sponsor of the exhibition rather than exhibiting in a certain sense, and having goodie bags with samples being given to gallery visitors. And it further led me to do things that I don't think I otherwise would have done, like collaborating with models and a dancer, and here making advertisements for the brand. And this is an advertisement that was made, published on social media, Facebook, Instagram, things like that. I'm just going to show that briefly. And so how does this tie into my PhD then? Well, my PhD, I started from a sort of similar position, a sort of similar interest in like paradoxical contrast, things that seem to be weirdly put together and trying to make them make sense somehow. And I started from a sort of similar thing where I took nature on the one hand and technology on the other hand, and how can those combine in some interesting form? And I wrote my PhD thesis, I would say, in a sort of subfield of, I guess, multiple disciplines, from system theory to philosophy to informatics to some forms of media studies, which you could call a form of digital biology. So thinking about digital systems, thinking about computers, thinking about networks, thinking about different media forms in terms of organisms, ecologies, evolution. And so I set up this structure for my thesis where I started with like the smallest components, microbes. I could perhaps have started with viruses as like virality. I have some thinking about that in there as well. But I thought about like computers and our relation to them as relations with microbes, and that we have a shared agency of sort. And then vegetative games, I thought about video games in a vegetative sense. Worldwide fungi, a sort of network approach from the perspective of fungi rather than the web with its certain associations. And then social petworks, thinking about social networking, Facebook, things like that from the perspective of mammal dynamics and domestication processes. And then the spread of memes. I looked at Donald Trump memes from the perspective of tribes, from the perspective of hunter-gatherer humor. And not content with doing these strange things, I also did something which is probably, I'm not sure how common it is, but I tried to, or maybe it's a common thing to say, but I tried to think about the objects that I analyzed, not only as things that I would find out things about, but rather also things that would influence me, my way of thinking, my perspectives, my approaches, the things that I could also learn something from. And as the title here indicates, diversions, I looked at distractions, I looked at the things that draw us astray. So cute animals in social media, memes, video games, things that we're wasting time on. And I thought, thinking not only about these, but also with them, how can I make my reflections playful, stupid, cute, and funny enough for people to bother diverting themselves from other diversions, to invest time in my reflections? Like I thought about, how can you write playfully? How can you write stupidly? How can you write in a cute way, in a funny way? And take this as a sort of challenge to myself, as a structure, format, conceptual challenge in the thesis, but also as a challenge, I guess, to the PhD as a format. What is actually allowed to do in a PhD? And I passed, but neither of the people in my committee mentioned any of this at all. So I'm not quite sure how to take that. Like, it feels like I delivered a jackass stunt as like a news report, and no one noticed that this was a stunt of some sort. But anyway, we can get back to that. This is my last slide and last thing I'm going to say for now. So I'm going to stop sharing and let Elisabeth jump in with her project and her approach.
Okay, let me see. Okay, well, Andreas has his artistic practice and he has his PhD as separate entities. For me, the artistic practice became part of the dissertation work itself. And my PhD consisted of a written dissertation and a 7-minute film experiment, which were in dialogue with each other. And I would say that I would not have been able to write that dissertation if I had not made that film experiment. It was like the thinking machine through which I generated perspectives and new theoretical interests and explorations. And to my surprise, my pleasant surprise, it has been doing well on its own, but it was not meant as a film, as a unity. It was a series of experiments, 3 experiments where I went back to my childhood village in the north of Norway and exploring that place with the camera and using different moving image techniques. So it was separate experiments, and I used the film as a way to think for me, and it was a distant, perhaps an unconscious goal to show it someday. It probably was, but that was not in the front of my head. So my project ended up to be an exploration of how the moving image thinks spatially and what I call topographically. How one can think differently through the camera than, for instance, writing. That it is it's a distinct technology of thinking, and it became a dialogue between writing and using the camera. So it's a way of researching how a researcher, filmmaker, or a humanist, or may use the camera as a way to research mediation, I would say. And that is how forms produced by technology, but also environmental forms, topographical forms, architectural forms, how these interact in shaping our perception of our environments or place, which is the concept that I'm using. So it was also a project of challenging the researcher's own habits of mind and go beyond frames of reference. Because I decided to use my own experience, because I realized that, in order to challenge people's habits of mind, I think you have to challenge your own first, but also because of, experimenting with the experience of others. There are some ethical issues with that, and it's kind of difficult. So I will start by showing a small clip of the film experiment. Let's play. Let's try to find out what's beyond the frame. Now, let's take it one step further. Okay, so let's take it one step further here as well. The process through which I made this film is very different from Andreas, in the sense that I only had a vague idea to start with of what I was interested in. And it was a long period of searching. I used most of the PhD time to search for theory, to experiment with writing, with the moving image, and like 5 or 4 months before the deadline, it came together finally. But then my supervisors, and Tim were one of them, were literally biting their nails. So it was very different. I was searching a lot, and it started in my practice as a documentary filmmaker in NRK. a fascination of the impact of form, and that was moving image form and how it shaped how we saw things, but also after having filmed a lot of places, you know, how topographical forms are shaping our, you know, thinking or way of life, and architectural forms. And I had a sense that these forms were playing together in a way that I could not articulate, but I had, you know, I was gravitating towards academia, and I wanted to find out. And at a certain point, I decided to merge an existential search and a personal project, which was to document my childhood village and my relation to that, with my research interest, because I thought that these interests are coming from the same place, internal place anyway. So why not try to see where my research practice and my creative practice, where it intersect. And what I found also was that experimental practice, moving image practice, and like the essay film or structural film, and certain kinds of research are kind of, the difference between them are so paper thin that I wanted to like remove that wall, or try to find out new ways of using the camera as means of research. So my starting point was in the film experiment, was somewhere very dear to, a place very dear to me. This is my kitchen, my grandparents' kitchen window, which is made into an imagery that evokes poetic meaning making. And I end up in the film with a crab taking control over the camera, so to speak, which is a completely other perspective. And I didn't see that coming. It was not something that was planned. I just ended up there. So it took a lot of theoretical searches and rewriting to get there. And I tried to be experimental in my writing as well as in my filmmaking, but you know, the feedback I got taught me that you know, that was too much, and it was not a PhD. So in the end, I did a lot of work in terms of literature review and all these things that I knew of these things already because I did so much research, but I kind of did it the ordinary way in writing. And the experiment was took less of part of the PhD than planned, but it worked and it was well received by the committee. So what I ended up with was an argument about how moving image thinking is intrinsically bound up with the way we orient ourselves in a geographical piece of land, and a way to identify structures, metaphors, and forms with which we think, and thereby I argue that we can look beyond them. So I call it a moving image topography. And it's my understanding of form is in a broader sense. For me, form is not only film form, but it's, you know, arrangement, ordering, and shaping. I'm trying to map form more openly as dynamics that you can recognize in different entities or spheres, either abstract or imagery or earth. And I have been looking for similar affordances in different structures for action. And I want to mention the last thing I want to mention is have affinities to Andreas' rules and frames. And that was one method that I came up with when I was doing this research, and that was to use geological forms in my experimental film. And these forms are describing the dynamics that appeared from practice, the dynamics in image and perception, this interplay between place, image, and perception. And I investigated these forms and dynamics, and those opened up new theoretical explorations. But they were also kind of structure mapping, enabling me to see structural likenesses in these entities that otherwise are perceived as isolated. So those were quite important in my experimental research. And that was it. I think it's time for a break. And then we will have a dialogue, me and Andreas, about our researches.
Yes, I would say we are really quite early, so
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether we
We could perhaps start the dialogue now, Elisabeth, if you'd like that, and we can include the audience after.
Yeah, I'm surprised that we're so early. That's a good idea, I think.
That's good in a sense, because we were thinking about this as a dialogue, but then we also need to show a lot of you who probably don't know anything about what Elisabeth and I have been doing. So to introduce you to our projects firstly. But I wanted to ask you, Elisabeth, because it's like when you mentioned at the end there coming into geology, like I would think that both of us seem then to be like open to a sort of radical interdisciplinarity. But I'm wondering, like, if there's like, what are the similarities and what are the differences between our approaches there? Because yeah, I can give some thoughts myself, but I wanted to hear yours first, I think.
Well, you're thinking about the way I use geology or
Yeah.
these forms, right? Yeah. Well, I was, catching you on your sofa in your office sometime reading Darwin, and I think that I was not reading a lot of geology. I was reading enough about these structures in order to understand accurately what they were and what they were doing, but I was not implementing geological theory into my research. So that is one difference.
Yeah.
But there are also similarities, perhaps, that you used structures from biology to kind of structure map technology or interaction with technology, right? Or
I think in that sense, there are definitely similarities in our approaches there in the sort of using these as formatting tools in a way. But at the same time, I would think that maybe pointing towards this distinction between like the conceptual and the experimental that we started from, like with your process, this is something that you were rather sort of through searching, through testing, through like teasing out, trying out, reaching towards, you found something that could somehow, speaking metaphorically, ground and somehow put into words certain things. Whereas like, and in my process, in my sort of project, this was more parameters to work from rather than sort of they're not findings, they're not sort of end points in that sense. They're more what I started from and what allowed certain forms of creativities. And I think that's an interesting sort of the difference there between moving towards or moving from as this conceptual experimental model there.
yeah. No, I agree. I in many ways I ended up there, it would be interesting if I started with those geological forms now and tried to do what you were doing, something similar. Where would I end up then?
Mm-hmm.
But that would be something different. But the geology was not like I thought, oh, geology, that would be interesting. That was not the the way it worked. It was more like, I've been interested in rocks since I was a kid, so it's just in the back of my mind that these structures are there and they're interesting. So, and I just came up with the idea when I experienced these dynamics, I thought, this is like sediments. This is like configurations. And I thought, well, it fits into a conceptual structure, I can make something out of it.
Mm.
So and then I gave names to these experiments. But that is different from like imposing a structure upon the image material, which would be like more, yeah, I don't know, would be something else.
I also, like, you pointed towards this distinction where sort of thinking about the relation between these artistic practices that we have and the thesis writing. And I think it's interesting that to a certain extent, your project does seem more sort of, there seems to be more of a unification in your thesis project and your artwork, in that, as you were mentioning at the beginning, they sort of, can't remember specifically the words that you use, but they're like, you couldn't have one without the other, sort of their way of thinking.
Yeah, I would say that while you've had an artistic practice and you wrote your dissertation as like two separate outcomes, you know, you're still the same person doing this, but I rather, I have, you know, created an artistic practice through research, you know, artistic research as well as a media research. So I was not doing artistic research or artistic practice before. I was, you know, doing something else, but I have used my research to, you know, I have been redirecting my practice. So that is very different. Yeah.
And I because it made me also think about the relation there between my practice and my thesis, because it's something that in a certain sense, yes, they are more distinct, but at the same time, I would think then, and this may be because I'm thinking conceptually and more than experimentally, but I would think of what I'm doing as modularity in a sense. So I have the module that is artistic practice, and I have the module that is thesis writing. And these modules can have a sort of similar set of ways of being built up, or they can have different ways of being built up. And I'm realize this might seem not entirely clear. It's something I'm trying to think of as I talk now, but it's like
it's can I, you know, can I just say it's totally clear. It's totally clear, because although it didn't emerge or was not that way with my research practice research, I understand what you mean, because now I am, you know, translating my thinking into different products. You know, I'm going to make an installation, but I'm also making film. So film is a different module or a different configuration of my images and thoughts and ideas than you know, the film and installation are different configurations of this outcome, different outcomes of the same thinking, so to speak. And I maybe that's similar, I don't know.
But in that sense, I was wondering, so for me, thinking about these as different modules as part of a sort of similar process, a similar package in a way. So thinking about the thesis writing as an extension of artistic practice rather than artist-led research or something like that. Thinking about, so what I'm trying to get at is in a lot of artistic research, it seems, you have this sort of, you create some artistic product, and then you create some sort of writing, and those in a sense mirror each other, they work with each other, they are different sediments of some layer. But I think part of what I tried in my thesis, and part of what made me use these terms of modularity, is to think the thesis writing in itself as the artistic, and I guess then product, thinking about this conceptual experimental dynamic then of like thinking about the thesis itself as potentially an object of artistic value. So to use then the text, and this is something I was getting at with these questions I had of like, and thinking then in terms of thinking about distractions, but also thinking with them. So how can I let these objects that I'm analyzing influence my way of writing, my way of thinking, and give shape to so in that sense, like I do think that there are definitely differences between the ways that we've intertwined or used artistic practice as part of their research. But I also think that both of us have like, there is a enmeshment of sorts between the ways that we've thought artistic practice.
So would you categorize yourself with Picasso, or
I hate Picasso.
totally with Picasso, or would you like you're not the gloomy Cézanne, are you?
I probably would categorize myself with Picasso in the schematics that you set up, but I really dislike Picasso as an artist, as his artwork. But I do think that this notion of like the search is maybe less relevant to me. That and I wonder if this is even allowed. You're even allowed to say something like that as a researcher, because it seems somehow the Cézanne position here, the experimental position here, is what is proper to a researcher, is what is proper to an academic, in that there is some valorization like towards the scale of experimental. What would you think about that, Elisabeth?
That could you
that
repeat
somehow
the most
I'm
important
thinking like if we set up this distinction, I tend to skew towards Picasso. I tend to skew towards his sort of product is everything, process is nothing approach, if we want to like be really flippant about it. But I'm wondering then, is there even a room for such a position in doing artistic academic research and like working creatively and writing?
Well, if you set up a set of rules, I mean, you can find things that are accurate still, right? But you can you're able to see things in a new way. And that doesn't mean that everything is totally fictional. I mean, that knowledge, but. No, I think that you can be able to see things that you otherwise would overlook by setting up a set of rules. But it is also a danger with it. I think that you kind of that you do not, that you project things, project patterns, and that's where I think that my emphasizing so much on practice made me not, refrain, help me not to create theoretical fictions and keep in touch with what was there. There were other challenges with that, of course, but yeah. So I'm curious of what others think about that, actually.
Yeah.
We are slowly getting towards a break, but because I've seen some of the way you had organized this conversation earlier, so I was wondering whether perhaps you can say something briefly about the issues of time and control, if these are the right keywords, in terms of what distinguishes your two approaches. Just for a few minutes, and then we can take a break, and then opening up to everyone.
Would you like to start, Elisabeth, or should I?
In terms of time?
Perhaps, yeah.
Yeah, well, the way I spent the time, I mentioned that it was a wild ride of searching, and I read an immense amount of theory, and my bookshelf was really heavy, and it was so I was spending a lot of time on searching. And well, the experimental way, yeah, it was a lot of trial and error. I was in like dead ends, and it took U-turns, and I went to places where I, you know, did have very little to do with what I wanted to do. So I had to kind of feel those walls in order to understand that I was not going there. It was like the method of elimination. Okay, not there, and not there, and then finally going into the right place. And that is strangely, that is a bit how I am like a person as well. I mean, I have to fail first in order to understand what's the right direction. And my impression is that you need more control. That we're over on that.
I mean, you can say some more about control if you want, and then I can go, or I can talk a bit about time first, I guess, because it's like, I think also, I was quite impressed when you did in the presentation here as well. You talked about how, and maybe I'm using a wrong kind of wording here, but like in your process, it seemed like towards the end, a sort of wave came of like everything settled in a sense, and everything came into writing. And I think, to me, like I spent a lot of time, even though I had from the start quite clearly for me what things were going to be like and where things were going to go. I spent a lot of time tinkering with, interacting with, and working with. Like, I had a text draft of what essentially turned into the first chapter. I had that ready after just a month or so. I had like a draft ready that would be reworked like 8 or 10 times. But I think this ties into then a sort of approach where, so working with writing as a form of system, working with something as a form of system that has its own boundaries, its own parameters, its own things of its own resistance in a way. And in that sense, this notion of control, yeah, I think to a certain extent, maybe I need more control than you, but to a other extent, I also really enjoy actually giving completely up control. So I had, for instance, in one chapter, I wrote about clickbait and networks, and I spent a lot of time clicking through and looking at clickbait, and wrote a bunch about like gender and relations in clickbait, and the really super stupid things in clickbait. And then for the last part of that chapter, I used a clickbait headline generator to create the headline of that chapter, which then put me in a sort of position where, okay, I need to make this make sense somehow. I need to, in a certain sense, make it reasonable, make it some part of some form of argument. So I did what, and this was part of the chapter on stupidity, part of a chapter on how networks make us stupid in a sense, but then to think about and theorize stupidity then not as something simply negatively, something that perhaps might have some survival value in evolution, perhaps something that can trigger and create creativity, and to make things, to actually then go in to make stupid choices myself and try to make them somehow make sense.
Yeah, so you tried to be stupid while I was being stupid, and
yeah.
before doing things correctly.
That's a great way of framing it. Like, I need someone else to make me capable of being
You need
stupid.
rules to be stupid.
Yes.
Lucky you. Okay. Well,
a good note to end on. Take a
perhaps.
break.
Okay, perhaps shall we end this part of the conversation here? So maybe we should take a 10 minutes break, and I hope all the participants are willing to come back again in 10 minutes, so that we can open it up and we can ask questions and getting to know each other and your experiences as well. Okay, so let's reconvene at 3 minutes past the hours. So I will see you all then. Okay, welcome back after the break. I hope everyone is back. So thanks again, Andreas and Elisabeth, for your presentation. Let's open perhaps to the floor.
Hi, I can maybe ask a question. So thank you very much for arranging this. It's been very inspiring. I'm a first-year PhD student at the University of Stavanger. I am in the field of environmental humanities. And I must say, I am very drawn towards experimentation, towards maybe more towards the method that Elisabeth has been using in terms of reflecting upon the tools of analysis, but also filmmaking as a thinking tool. I'm very drawn to that. And I actually am receiving my camera tomorrow, which I'm going to use for that matter in my research. Anyway, my question is rather practical, and it relates to Elisabeth, your supervisor's biting nails and stress about the process, because I find myself in situations quite often that, and that's understandable, that people want to know what I will be doing. So I assume that, and I also want to hear from Andreas on that matter, because when you know what you're going to do and you can present preliminarily what you want to do, you get more support. And of course, everyone wants to see you succeed and be able to deliver on time. So there's always this stressful situation in terms of experimentation and spending time on exploration. So I wanted to hear how you dealt with that, and whether you guys had the support of your supervisors or some other colleagues that could help you through the way.
Well, good question. I have one of my supervisors here today, which was Tim Vermeulen. So he might add his experience. Yeah, well, I had a supervisor from the start. One supervisor, Tim, came in at a later stage. And I was supposed to do something that was quite different. I was supposed to research idea development in television. So I did quite a lot of, I was redirecting my research quite radically. I had the support I felt from my supervisor, Gunnar Liestøl, when it came to finding my own thing. So I was provided the space to find my own thing, and I was not restricted in terms of finding it, although I, of course, could notice that I was moving away from his kind of specialty. And Tim Tim came in as a supervisor, not as a supervisor first, but he came as a colleague who I could think with. So we had conversations, and we discussed, spatial theory, and it was through these conversations that I came to my final research, I would say. Not only through these conversations, but that was a great help. So it was a thought process, which he was, a part of, and then he eventually became my supervisor. So, yeah, well, I think I had an amazing a lot of freedom to develop my own thing, and that is a kind of a support as well, and trust. I mean. Although I think that they might have been worried, and I know they have been worried at times that it would end up where it would end up, but they did not stop me. Yeah, did that answer your question somehow?
Yeah, it did, and I must say I also get some support, but it's usually like they will let you do anything if you kind of can promise that you will be able to do it, and that's such a difficult promise to make, especially when you're dealing with experimentation. So yeah, that's the difficult part. But yeah, thanks.
I mean, no, yeah, I think it's very hard to promise an outcome when you're doing experimentation, because you might fail, but that is also a kind of a research, right?
Yeah.
So, but I understand how it can collide with more traditional academia, and that you need some people that are particularly open-minded towards that kind of processes, I think.
Then I also think that perhaps your background in filmmaking was also a source of for trust for people, that they knew that you were kind of able to incorporate filmmaking without spending too much excess energy or time on it, and you could use it as a tool very efficiently. So maybe that's something that I also need to work on a bit.
Yeah, that might be part of the picture.
I mean, if I can add one or two thoughts as as Elisabeth's former co-supervisor. I mean, I think this is a really good question in a way, because in the case of Elisabeth, both Gunnar, the other supervisor, and I knew from the get-go, and increasingly as Elisabeth was developing a project, that she was doing something very special. But the moment sort of that it became special, and the moment that she started doing more of that experimental stuff, was also simultaneously the moment that, oddly enough, we began to worry, because we also thought, how will it fit with the committee? How will this fit with the sort of the idea of the PhD that we have? And so it is a difficult thing, because I think both as a PhD candidate and as a supervisor, you want to support something. And that was easier for me before I was supervisor, because then I could fully support it. And when I became supervisor, I thought, okay, but she also has to make sure, or I have to help her pass this hurdle. And so I think there is always this sort of tension in the current setup in Norway, in any case, to both do that experiment, but there has to be some kind of end product that is readable by a committee, right? And given that this sort of research is relatively new, the committee might not be familiar or have done those same sort of procedures, in the same way that, grant applications like ERC always stress interdisciplinarity, but then everyone who will read that grant application is precisely from one discipline, right? And so there's that similar sort of thing. Everyone wants experimental research, but when push comes to shove, there still is that moment when. So I think it's a balance, and I'm wondering. I mean, in a way, I also think that's what precisely makes it exciting, because I think because Elisabeth constantly had that in the back of her mind, and if she didn't, then I think Gunnar and I constantly told her to have it in the back of her mind. I do think those sort of boundaries also create very exciting, sort of ruptures and moments of tension. I don't know, but that would be my 2 cents on the side.
Unless Andreas has something to add, I know Espen had a question.
I could perhaps, but I mean, I would perhaps draw us astray a bit, but I enjoy doing that. I would perhaps sort of challenge here this notion of sort of the want for experimental research, and the way that that seems then to very often draw away from the text. That somehow seems to imply that when you're experimental, you need a camera, or you need to set up an exhibition, or you need to write fiction for that matter. Like I would push towards thinking, are there also experimental, and maybe this is then the conceptual, I don't know, are there also ways of trying to do that within the format that you're actually also working in? Like, do you need to pick up the camera? Do you need the camera specifically? I guess for you, you probably thought about that as something that you want to explore, and that you have some form of thing that you're working towards with that, I guess. But like, I just wanted to push, mostly because this is sort of aligning with my interests as well, like to also think then about the writing of a thesis, the writing of a book, the writing of an article as possibly something that you can experiment with or make conceptual in a sense. And like for specific tips, like show things to people, get feedback. Like people will improve both the video material and the writing that you do. So share things is a good.
Sorry, my turn?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. It's really interesting. This axis between experimental and conceptual, of course, you know, you're tempted to try and diagnose yourself as either Picasso or Cézanne. But I was wondering whether research, as more conventionally understood, could itself be categorized as more conceptual. I don't know if that's actually the case, but it's sort of superficially, it seems to me that, you know, what is research traditionally conceived? Yeah, it's setting up a load of premises, you know, typically methods, a set of questions or hypotheses, and then you sort of set in motion an investigation on top of that, and you know, it confirms what you thought in some respects, and it doesn't in other respects. So I was just wondering whether what you think of that, whether a conceptual approach to creativity is more sort of in line with traditional expectations to research and the creative element in all research than the experimental sort of end of that continuum.
You're on mute, Elisabeth.
Yeah, my immediate thought would be that yes, it aligns more with traditional research in setting up in the way you spend the time, that you're setting up rules to begin with. Yeah. While experimental research is more, you know, you have a vague idea. You do not want to be, you know, limited by research questions early on, because it limits your scope. You want to be roaming around. You need to like paint all those 80 times or do all this. You need to be doing trial to do errors as well. So, and that's why I think that experimental creativity or experimental creatives may have more difficulties in traditional academia than perhaps conceptual oriented, if you can say that, if you can categorize people like that. It might be more difficult to get it into a shape that fits into the traditional academic outcome.
I was actually pushing against that very notion in the previous session when I stated something like, is it even possible? Are you even allowed to be a conceptual researcher in the sense that Elisabeth presented Picasso? Because Picasso is interested in the product rather than the process. And that would seem then to go against research as somehow a search. So I would actually frame it in terms of the experimental method of setting some questions, using some object like the camera, for instance, as part of a process would seem actually to fit quite neatly into certain ideals of what research is supposed to be. And then if you frame it in terms of the results, then maybe the conceptual approach seems more reasonable. But if you frame it in terms of the process, then I do think the experimental one actually seems more fitting in that sense.
I'm wondering whether perhaps research implies both kinds of creativity, but in a kind of a controlled sense.
Yeah.
You know, while we are speaking of extremes, and it's not, you know, given that this economist doing his study on Picasso was right about Picasso being content with only the result and not the process. I mean, it could be not totally accurate either, that too. So yeah, but I think research is perhaps a combination of the approaches.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that seems to make sense. And I wouldn't be surprised if Picasso was he was kind of exaggerating, or he was boasting when he said, you know, I don't search, I find. Yes, so he said it. You know, doesn't make it entirely convincing just because Picasso said it.
There is a wonderful quote by Picasso where he says something along the lines of, like, he's painting the portrait of some lady, and he asks for, I don't know, like a lot of money for that painting, and then the lady is upset because she says, like, you've drawn like one brushstroke, this took you 2 seconds, and then he says, lady, it took my entire life to paint this painting. So it's like he had a way of those statements as well. So, but that also indicates a different form of process. And I would also say, in the same sense as Elisabeth, like me reaching towards biology is also a process. It's also like not necessarily only a starting point from my project. It's also something that I came to after years of thinking and researching. So, and I also really enjoy like reframing that Picasso story in that sense. It didn't only take Picasso's life to do that. It took the entirety of human evolution to get to something like that.
Okay, I know that Amos has a question.
Yes, hi, thank you. And thank you for this presentation. So I'm a PhD student at Aarhus University, and I'm studying more or less tinkering or collective creativity. My background is as a designer of what are called tinkering activities in places like Lego House and other things like that. And as I was listening to your description of these sort of experimental versus conceptual approaches, I was reminded of a model that was developed by a friend of mine, Mitchell Resnick, who I used to work with. It's very simple, so I'll just show it to you here. Thanks for allowing me to share the screen. It's called the creative learning spiral. And essentially, he created this model to describe what goes on, for example, with children in kindergarten when they're playing with Lego bricks, that they imagine something and then they create it out of the Lego bricks or out of whatever it is that they're using. And then they play with it to sort of see how it interacts in the world that they're imagining around it and get feedback from it. And then they share it with somebody else and get feedback from them. Then they're reflecting again and sort of imagining what could be the next step. And then, as you can see, it's sort of designed to be a spiral. So it continues on and on infinitely. And as I was sort of, listening to you guys speak about these different approaches, I was wondering, is it possible that, is there a dialogue essentially between this sort of more conceptual and experimental understanding, such that really you guys are describing, when you talk about the experimental versus the conceptual, two different entry points into a spiral very much like this. But regardless of the entry point, there must be a conversation essentially between those two ideas. And if that's the case, then I think, it's interesting to imagine because one of the problems and one of the beautiful things I've always felt about this model is that it works very well for describing a whole entire PhD over the course of 3 years, but it also works at describing 5 minutes of playing with Lego bricks. It's what you might call scale invariant, and that can make it somewhat confusing in some ways. But I just wonder if that model makes any sense to you in terms of framing it as a dialogue.
Do you want to respond to that, Andreas?
I have lots of things to respond to that. So if you have something, I would suggest you go first, but I have lots of things I want to say. So
I think that this one shouts for you, Andreas. Just,
I wanted to also show, because I love these sort of models, and I wanted to just show one of my own, and this comes from a blog that I've been doing for a couple of years, which I've called Proof of Concept, even before thinking I was a conceptual thinker, but just to note down some ideas and things I've been thinking about. And here I had this like distinction between two modes of thought, two basic operations of thinking. So you have the spiraling mode, and it aligns with your sort of model of the spiral. And this way of moving further and further into a material, moving further and further into a research, into your thought process, or something like that. And then a different form, a bouncing ball, which is back and forth between yourself and a material, not further and further into some research, but perhaps away from what you're supposed to be doing towards something else, meeting that something else, getting back to what you were doing, and then back and forth between that. And I think what I wanted to show with this sort of distinction here is that the spiral has its own sort of affordances, and I don't necessarily want us to like accept that as the only way of thinking creatively, the only way of playing, the only way of approaching a play session, even because in what you sketched out as well, there is this imagining as the first step. And I think for some people, yes, definitely imagining makes so much sense as a first step. But there are also people who don't have visual imagination, for instance. They can't visualize things. And so you could think that these kind of people are more oriented towards, I don't know, interacting with the world without the preface of the imagination sense. They would start a play session from a different form of mode. So they would start perhaps of trying out the Lego set. So what can we do with putting together these? And then from starting to put these together would get then, okay, this starts to work like something, this starts to become something. And so what I'm sketching out here is a sort of thinking where you can either start from this sort of position of, I know where I'm going to go with this. I know I'm going deeper and deeper into my own material, or I'm trying to work together with the system I'm interacting with. And that system itself has a lot of input on where to go. And it can be the starting, it can be the leading figure in that. There's a sort of material sense of play in that sense. Yeah, and Tim, this resembles the hermeneutical circle spiral versus postmodernism. Yeah, maybe. I don't know where I have it from, and I don't know where it came from, but that's a good place to look into in that sense. I didn't mean to like take the whole floor here on that. But, no, I really enjoy models like this. I think they're so much fun, and I think they're so much fun precisely because they allow distinctions like this. They allow us to see that wait, maybe not everyone starts by imagining things. Wait, maybe not everyone starts by experimenting. Wait, maybe some start with a concept, maybe some start in a searching mode, and to think that these can be different moduses, or they can be different people having different approaches, and the sort of openness to difference in a way is allowed precisely by structuring, I think, in this sense.
Can I also share something, or is it someone having a question?
No, you go ahead. I have a question, but you go ahead first.
Okay. I will share this one, which is a cyclic web. It's illustrating how a creative practice researcher goes from idea to idea or practice to practice, research practice and creative practice. You can start anywhere on this circle. You can start by, generating an idea. You can start by, you can be anywhere, and then you can, move almost anywhere. You can do research, theoretical research, and then you get an idea of a creative practice, and then you generate some interesting findings that send you back to theoretical research, or it can send you to idea generation, or it could send you somewhere else. So the thing with the creativity is that it doesn't have a linearity. You can and it moves in unexpected ways and makes unexpected associations, right? So that's why I think that you can have an artistic practice and you can write a dissertation, and it's connected because you move through these different phases, right? And it's you can think of it as a spiral, but you can also think of it as a web. So that's the shapes through which we think, and so on. And
thank you.
Stop sharing.
Thank you, Amos, for the wonderful model and
yeah, thank you so much.
And I'll ask a question as well. Because I think maybe it's kind of obvious to us here in this forum who discuss about this, but I think it's not to everyone, because normally when we approach research, we think about gathering data, processing data, and it's almost like data is out there. We go there, we harvest the data, we collect it, and then we do something with it. We manipulate it. But then, I mean, your attitude is different, because you are not the one who manipulates the data. You are working with the data. So the data and the materials, they have their own agency. And I think it's also this explicit recognition that you can work with it, and that from this relationship, there are new things that are going to come up. So I think despite the fact that it's true that you come at it from different perspectives, but I think you both share the same attitude to the material. And so that you are ready to allow the material to give you insight. Andreas, you were saying you can learn from things, but also Elisabeth, you use the film as a thinking device, so you allow the film to help you to think. So I was wondering whether you can elaborate on what is your relationship to the material, and what is your attitude to the material you work with.
Oh, wow. Do you have something instant, Andreas?
I mean, as Christina pointed to, we both have, like, as she said, you're working with a camera as a thinking device, for instance. But I think, to me, working from theories of new materialism, of speculative realism, object-oriented ontology, these are sort of theoretical perspectives that start from the position that things interact in ways that are not reducible to what we think of and say about these things. So I don't know, if I pour out my water on the keyboard, the computer will be destroyed, things like that. But then also, in that sense, if you think about materials and objects, then as having interactions with each other, as having, as you talked about, some form of agency, then you can, I think at least, use that as part of the research process, part of the writing process, part of the thinking process. So what kind of insight can be, and this is why I used a clickbait headline generator as sort of something that formatted and structured my perspective. But I also had a similar perspective again on the clickbait, in the clickbait chapter, where I had a perspective of okay, so what would clickbait reveal about human beings? if I approached clickbait as a form of artificial, maybe not intelligence, maybe artificial stupidity, if I approached it as something that has some form of, and this almost sounds parodical, but I think that's maybe something I'm drawn towards as a tool, but to use then these clickbait as a form of swarm intelligence, a swarm stupidity that generates some form of impression of humans, that has some form of understanding of humans that is not reducible to what the people who would have set up these clickbait have put into them, because they're also made by people clicking these things. They're made they're made in interaction between the populations of people setting up clickbait and the population of people clicking it. So the point then, this is a form of then an emergent form of intelligence or stupidity, an understanding of humans. And I made like a brief section where I had like, what would clickbait, how would they experience humans? So trying to work towards like different forms of materials, different forms of objects, agency and intelligence in a way. And I realized the parodic nature of this venture.
Thank you.
I could just add, from in my project, materials have also agency in the sense that they transform and shape perspective and reflection, and enables new theoretical perspectives upon, you know, what I'm researching. So so it's letting the material take control over the course of the research in a way, or influencing it, or taking mediation seriously by letting materials mediate the thinking as well, or like reflecting on the effect. The approach have been called like cine-philosophical investigations, and that is perhaps a good term, although it's not doing philosophy. It's a reflection in conversation with materials, so to speak.
So can you say again how it's called? Is it semi-philosophical? I missed the word.
Cine, sorry, yeah, that's not very obvious. Cine, yeah, like cinematic.
Okay, yeah.
So we're not gathering data in the traditional sense. That was an issue in my process as well.
And I have lots of reading tips if you want for new materialists and speculative realists, Christina.
Yeah, thank you. Don't know if there are any more questions. Otherwise, I can ask one more, because I was wondering whether yeah, you've said already that, okay, these are two extremes, but in fact, you are kind of dipping into different strategies. But I don't know, are there any tips maybe on how to integrate these processes? Because, for example, I see I can definitely identify more with the experimental, and so I think Elisabeth's process sounds totally familiar. But then I see that, for example, sometimes when I hit the wall and I realize there are limitations to what I do, so then those limitations actually become very useful, because I think, okay, I just need to use this playground rather than everything, and that helps. So I was wondering whether maybe you have tips on what to do when you hit that wall.
Well, I think you just said it. I mean, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade, something like that. Yeah, to see opportunities when you are limited, and to turn those limitations to rules that you can actually be creative from is one of them, I guess. Hitting that wall, try somewhere else. There are perhaps other loopholes. Be like water, find other ways. These are cliches, but I mean, it's true as well. Do you have any other, Andreas?
I think you're right about Christina sort of giving the answer already, but I also really think that the way that we frame limitations is very often a sort of like we hit a wall or we're sort of confounded by limitations and we don't know how to continue. But I really, and maybe this is me from a more conceptual approach, but or maybe it's a sort of embracing of limitations, but I really do think that thinking in terms of, and again, goes back to just what you were saying, Christina, like thinking in terms of a playground, thinking in terms of specific interaction possibilities, specific boundaries, what is possible from within this specific boundaries, how can we shift it slightly towards something else, what is possible of doing. And I have some like specific examples of this in like a teaching context rather than research context, because it's something like I've been thinking about and reading about because I've been doing teaching recently. And one of them is like this very simple experiment that I used where I used and I can maybe link to this. I used this Zoom alternative. I use this Zoom alternative, which is a very like silly, nostalgic video game kind of look where you can walk around with a little avatar and talk with people with that. And it turns the teaching session into a complete mess. But it's also something that can be nice to break up a long session and to do something else and try out different set of boundaries and parameters. And the second is, I've been reading about John Cage in his practice, and he seems definitely to be like a conceptual end of the scale, in that he seems to be someone who loves to set up like formats and boundaries and things like that. And he, in teaching, he had this way of teaching where he assigned all of the students for his class to go into the library and pick up a random book and to come in and present that as part of the class. So there was no curriculum, and he wasn't the expert on what they were doing, which then made sure that he was also in a learning session. He wasn't actually the expert they were coming to. And of course, this sounds like something that would be quite difficult to do in teaching or in research or something like that. I mean, going in, picking random books in the library. But I think part of what I'm trying to get at here is that you can think of like set a rule, set a boundary of some form, and think of, okay, what can be done within this format? What can be explored and experienced here?
And I think that those kind of setting up those kind of rules can unleash creativity and open up an experimental process again, right? Yeah. So you can begin searching. You do not know where you end up, but you have a starting point.
Yeah, which again goes back to this notion that we had of like, rather than think of this perhaps as an opposition, as you are more like that or me, I am more like that, we can have this like we start there or we start there and then we go there and then, yeah.
I like to think of it as attitudes, that you're taking in a conceptual or experimental attitude, and perhaps you're inclined to one or the other as a person, but it is kind of obvious, I think, that both of us had like, we were using both attitudes in our research, and I was ending up with a conceptual rule in my research through an experimental process, a process that was, you know, very much experimental, and you were experimenting as well within your frames, not knowing where you were going. So for me, it seems like these, you know, the spectrum is rather simplistic, but you can, as active attitudes, as a researcher and artist, you can play with these attitudes, and they come up when they, you know, when it's needed.
Can I ask about the oblique strategies, Amos, if you wanted to mention what those?
Yeah, so the musician Brian Eno or a musician and producer, I guess he's most famous for, created a deck of cards called Oblique Strategies. And this was, sort of a way for people when they're in creative difficulties to try something new and strange. So there are a few, what are the canonical examples of this? But they were essentially ways of kind of getting unstuck. So, for example, there's one like use an old idea, or only one element of each kind, or what would your closest friend do? So they're a little bit, it's almost like introducing noise into the system when you get kind of stuck. And this apparently worked a lot for Eno and his various creative projects.
Thank you. That's
cool.
That sounds nice. I'll look into those.
All right, I will too.
Okay, so I don't know if there aren't any more questions, then we are done for today. Yeah, thank you again, Andreas and Elisabeth. So this was incredibly fascinating and informative and interesting. I'm just going to plug our next seminar, which is going to take place on the 20th of May. It will have as our guest Gunnar Listøl, who will be talking about experiencing digital simulations. I don't know, Amos and Maddie, whether you are on our mailing list, but if yes, okay. So if you're not, then please, I don't know whether Matilde, can you write down your email address?